Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for coming to this session. And thank you so much for the work. I have to be honest, I'm struggling a lot because I have like a minimum of 16 bloodlines that are just going crazy right now, and so I also do take it as a sign of very important work. And there was a sense of like a resounding joy and pride of the people that you are, as I've been celebrating the work and the intentionality of the work that you have been doing. And I am so upset that, you know, it's a context where there's not a kubu, so we can just like really just, but we will do it in different ways. Thank you everyone and welcome. I will introduce the panel and the books that we will be discussing. And I would like to welcome Jeffrey, who has written the wonderful book, Led by the Shepherds, and Vusi, who's written the book, Journey Ngxande, as also part of his award-winning podcast. And my sister in colonial disruptions and fires at UCT, Zara, who has written an amazing art book, a funeral. And I would love for you to please give them a round of applause. So I'm gonna start, and I was going through the questions with someone, and they were saying, "Oh my gosh, these are essay questions," and I really want to capture, and give context to the discussion in the questions, just because it's going to be like the small taste of the level of depth that and intentionality. I go back to that word that this book has. So I do apologize, but I will be contextualizing the questions so that we are all in the same page, and by reading maybe some of the paragraphs as well. I'm gonna start with you, Vus. A few months ago, I was speaking to a Ugandan colleague of mine, and I was really interested in how other African people from different spaces, who live in South Africa, see us, just as a way of self-reflection around like what are people seeing. And one of the things that he said to me was he senses displacement around among Black South Africans in the conversations that he's been having. And he said he worries because he thinks when you look into the world, your point of view is from a place where you are located, or the land where you are located. And he worries about how he feels, we are suspended in grief, and, a sense of confusion or displacement. And this made me think about spiritual purgatory of Blackness under coloniality, and how it sometimes feels to me like we're suspended mid-air in a spiritual purgatory in between realms almost. And in your book you assert that we are people of the meantime, and you reference the Hiviri, song. And I wanted to ask about the potential opportunities and the dangers of being people in the meantime, and what do you mean by that?
The context to that, Hiviri, in the meantime, I feel like it's a very prophetic song. In many ways. For those who don't know, it's a very popular, it's like the underground anthem in townships. If you say to any Black person, just say Hibiri, they want to say in the meantime. which is a house song, if I can call it that. But the reason I wanted to sort of use that as a way to encompass where we are is that I feel like we're in between spaces. We're in between different identities. We are those people. For me, we are the generation that was born just before 1994 and grew up in this new South Africa, and now we're sort of witnessing another transition into something that is not entirely clear what it is. And for me, as much as it is unnerving in many ways, I wanted to sort of embrace that. I wanted to go into a process whereby, if that's where we are, then that's where we are. And what does this mean that we are in the in-between? Because I feel like a lot of our anxiety and my personal anxiety is rooted in the fact that I'm desperately trying to figure out what's going to happen tomorrow. And the world is shifting in such drastic speeds that it's nearly impossible to know what it is that we're actually going into. So my thing was like, okay, if we are in between spaces, to use a biblical analogy, if we are now in the period in the desert, as it were, maybe then let's just embrace that that's where we are. And the danger in being the in-between people is not embracing the fact that we're in the in-between people, because then I feel like we're going to want to root ourselves at a midpoint in a journey when we're supposed to say, let's just keep going. We can't be here. One of my favorite scenes in movies was in Avengers, where Thanos has snapped his finger and people started disappearing. And there's a scene where Black Panther goes to one of his warriors and said, "This is not a place to die." For me, that's what being an in-between people means for me, is that this is not a place to die. Yes, this is where we are, but this is where we need to pass. It is important for us. I want to embrace the fact that we are not where we want to be. We are not at the promised land. We are still on a journey. We don't know where we're going. But if we keep focusing on the fact that we aren't there, instead of embracing that, while we're here, what can we do? Sorry to make this question a bit long. A couple of weeks ago, I took my family to Sun City, and when you're in Sun City, there's this place called the Maze, where you have to sort of try to, so I was stuck in it with my son, and I have to admit this, there was a point I was really scared that we're not going to make it out. And I was like, okay, we need to figure out a system. We have to embrace the fact that we are lost. Because if we don't embrace it that we're lost, then we're going to panic. And we're just going to keep going around in circles, and we keep getting even more lost. So for me, the importance of being the in-between people is embracing the fact that this is where we are, but this is not where we're going to die.
Thank you so much for that. Zara, this is the long question. You write, it interests me that less than 20 years prior to the Land Act came the 1895 Witchcraft Suppression Act of the Cape Colony. There was a conscious attempt by colonial administrations to sever the relationship between indigenous people and the land where death rites were practiced, and the relegation of these practices not just to the realm of belief and symbolism, but criminality. In the South African context then, the wielding of the Witchcraft Suppression Act alongside the Land Act meant that the subjugation of the black population as units of labor, the simultaneous criminalization of black wandering, and the transformation from land as being into land as private property. Most notably, this is the double purgatory of dispossession. This is such an important question, that a connection that you make, and I wondered if you'd want to talk a little bit about that and the double purgatory.
Yeah, so when I had made this connection, when I found out about this connection, like my mind kind of blew, right? I was like, whoa, like people really knew what they were doing in trying to strip us from our sense of self. And I think it's also an important part that the Witchcraft Suppression Act was often, at least in Great Britain, it was often invoked under the Vagrancy Act, right? So like this question of wandering is literally the point, like turning us into wanderers on our own land. So this question of double dispossession, on the one hand, is thinking about the dispossession of people from land, but also the dispossession of ourselves, understanding ourselves as deeply connected with the natural world, right? Understanding ourselves as an extension of the sea, understanding ourselves as an extension of land, understanding ourselves as an extension of the tree under which the umbilical cord is buried, you know. These are really integral parts, I think, at least for Black indigeneity, and I obviously understand indigeneity in an expanded sense in the South African context, right? Black indigeneity, yeah, these are really like foundational aspects of how we understand ourselves as Black people here. That we're really, really systematically and like, they were kind of focused. I mean, you got to give them that, right? Really systematically kind of severing this relationship, excuse me. So that's kind of the double purgatory. And obviously, like Solomon Pike, he touches on this in a way in the burial, in his book, Native Life, where there's a child that's buried in an unmarked grave, and this family that gets pushed off their land are made to be wanderers in the kind of Karoo, right? So that's kind of what I'm thinking through, is the dispossession of land, dispossession of our relationship with the natural world as this deeply intertwined thing, but then also the dispossession of ourselves from our like spirituality, which I think is an important component too. And then these questions, I mean, you were speaking about purgatory, then these questions around, you know, like the Reformation become actually central to understanding how all of this stuff became further and further away from us, because the Reformation also has a really interesting connection with this idea of purgatory and removing death actually from the ways in which Christianity, or at least belief, is practiced. And so these are the kinds of things I'm thinking through, and so maybe I'll stop there and we can go deeper into all these little networks. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Jeffrey, song seems to play an Jeffrey's book is about his journey into the initiation process, and song seems to play an important role in the initiation process into manhood. Your description of how song plays a role in initiating boys into violent masculinities, the examples of Black women as witches, the penis as a spear, etc. This got me thinking about the transcendent nature of song for me, and how this then becomes a process of spiritual capturing young boys. And also a way in creating spiritual vows almost into this violent masculinity during this initiation process. And I wondered, what is the cultural significance of song for you in that context? And if violent masculinities are consolidated through a spiritual sonic vow making, how can gender theory and book feminism help us, or how far can it take us into reclaiming African masculinities from this spiritual capture?
Thank you. So you, as a Black person, when you grow up and born inside your culture, you take it for granted to learn from it, so you believe it's inherent in you. And my first encounter with culture was when I was 12 years old, and it's the most important culture in South Africa, the transition from boyhood to manhood, whatever that means. And it's wonderful to be a man, and we yearn for it, even though the process is an existential crisis, but we yearn for that death. So when I cried to go to the initiation when I was 12. It was something that I was born inside, and it was something that I had to and I must do, and there was no way no one could stop me. But when I got in that bush, in that forest, where it is this big African ritual, something was off to what was promised. That fantasy that was built in my mind. It was a moment where truth and fantasy danced together, and questions started arising. And then I realized, and I wished I listened to my mother, who cried for me that I should not go to that place. And I got initiated. That was the first step. And that initiation is done through a very painful song, that here he is, a coward, lover of women. Remember when you used to hide behind your mother? Now where's your mother today? And it was kind of shocking. I started crying even before the initiation was done. So by the time I was initiated, I was screaming. But they say, don't scream. They are making you a man. And don't tell your mother that this ritual is a knife, it's about a knife, and it's a night creature. And I got initiated, and the first thing after getting initiated is that everything changes. You shed your name, your identity, and everything. You get called in a singular name. And we started being taught songs, and the meanings, the language changes. So a table is no longer a table, it's called something else. And we started singing songs, poetries. We glorified the pennies and looked down on the female part, and we became vulgar, violence. And we had to force that thing to ourselves in a sense of peer pressure and appeasing the ancestors and the men. So I don't know if I answered you correctly.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it was really hard to read your book, Jeffrey, as a Xhosa woman, because I think I did not understand how deeply ingrained it was for me, the secrecy, that it felt like I was doing something wrong. And I had to constantly just be interrogating the fear that I had and during, while reading. It felt like there was a man waiting to punish me, that I was, and it's very interesting that the secret, how secrecy plays a role in us having these conversations about what actually happens, and why do tender young boys go in as tender young boys and die there, and who are these men that come? Because one of the amazing things you say is that when you came out, there was a silence that fell on you from the world, from women, from older women, from younger women, that masculinity came with with dying and a sense of silence. And I'm wondering if you can maybe even speak to that.
Yeah, I think the first thing that you're being taught there is silence, in the sense that what you are being taught is that you are intimidated. I don't know if this is true, but I'm still waiting to see. Maybe I'll get to prove that. You are told that if you ever sniff out these initiation codes or secrets, that there are two things: it's madness or death. So I'm still waiting to see which one will happen to me, or both. So you give boys, young boys as 10, 12 into that process of holding that secret inside without knowing what that secret is doing to them. And is that the good thing is that indoctrination and domestication of young boys is that it goes simple. That's why we go there when we are young. And I did not realize that until later on in my life, because I wanted to pretend that it was okay. I wanted to pretend that I've conquered. I went there and I came back. So what happened to me did not matter, and how it impacted my life did not matter, until I got to a point where, after the death of Winene Mkhwechane, I told myself that maybe we need to find a way to talk about what is happening to young men and as to how that affects women in South Africa. And kind of do a comparison studies in the sense of cultural initiation that are taboo, that men don't want us to go to that place. And maybe we need to get to a point where we shame the shameless and put them in a place where we have a conversation about what is happening in the mountains, because being in a room full of men, learning how to be a man, it's just bad, you know. You're just performing masculinity and not learning how to be a human being, and all that silence and everything, people are still afraid of speaking out. I'm scared that I spoke out too, but what is the worth of a single man's life compared to the millions of South Africa? So that secret, it's not even a secret, it's nonsense. And we need to tell it the way it is, that culture, that ritual, I'm not saying it must be abolished, but that kind of nonsense that is being fed to young boys and glorified and not letting the women inside needs to stop. Because we are suffering. Men, boys are dying. They died recently in June. They're still going to die in the Eastern Cape. They've lost their manhood. They're peeing through tubes, catheter. It's just horrible, and nobody's doing anything. No one.
Yeah, thanks. You know, one of my best people in the world, Tiane, says that one of the violences of the English language is that it really removes and it makes us do verbal acrobats around things that are very easily accessible in our indigenous languages. And isiXhosa, when someone goes into a process alive and they come back as a living dead, we call it uktwebula. And I just want to throw that out there before I go to you, Vusi. Vusi, you speak about the story of Ngxande, and you speak about it from a very interesting new perspective that I had not heard of before, because of your encounter with an archive, Ubabu William Wellington Kopa, who was alive at the time, you know, and recounts what happened. And I want for you to take us through, you know, through that, like how is this story different in your book, and how, you know, that came about.
Okay, to give context as to why this particular story is in the book in the first place, is that it goes with the theme of being alive in a world that feels like it's falling apart. I wanted to I write to deal with my own anxiety. So I was at a point where I feel like the world is falling apart. There's so much change that is happening. And how do I know that we're going to survive this? So my only recourse, I felt like, okay, let's go back into history. Has there been times where things changed drastically for people, where it felt like the world was going to fall apart? So I looked at, you know, past historical moments where, you know, cataclysmic things would happen to groups of people where it felt like the world was falling apart. So I came across this, I remember the story of Ngxande, whereby for you know, the general understanding of it is that there was this little Xhosa girl who made a prophecy that she was told by the ancestors that she has to, the people in the village have to kill their cows and burn their crops, and then that way it would almost be like a way of appeasing the ancestors, and then there'll be sort of, the land will be reborn as a land of plenty, and all the suffering would end, and all of those things. And what ended up happening was that one of the greatest famines to ever happen to a culture in the country unfolded, and many hundreds of thousands of people died in the process of famine. So I wanted to look into the story to sort of try to locate my own anxiety, like how did it feel and what led people to making those kind of decisions. You know? So I went there with the aim of understanding what happened in that period, only to find that, you know, there were different accounts. And the more I thought about it, the more the story didn't make sense. Is that how did a whole group of people listen to this teenage girl, which led to basically, mass suicide of a people? Why did no one listen or think about this can't, be true? And what I found was there were different retellings of the story. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to find information written as close to that time as possible. So I found writings by Bob Goba, who was at the time a writer and a journalist. And him and Ngxande basically, in terms of timelines, they were alive at the same time. And I say this because, not to say that his account is more factual, but it's closer to the truth than where I am now. So my understanding is that if you can get information that is close to that time, you can glean some information from it. And what he says was there was actually a lot more that happened to the people at the time. And for a simple thing was that it wasn't just that this little girl had this apparition as we've come to believe. Yes, she did have this apparition where she met spirit and she was told that this and this and this needed to happen. But that was not the thing that led to people doing what ended up happening. One of the kings at the time, he actually listened to the girl, and she said, maybe we should listen to it, but we sort of need proof. And they told this little girl, and spirit told this girl, like, if the people don't believe you, tell the leaders of the villages, the different chiefs of the different sub-tribes, to tell them to go meet at a particular place. And what we will do, we will show them the vision. And this is what happened. The different leaders of the different smaller tribes met at a particular part of the ocean, and they saw the vision for themselves. And this is what convinced them. Like, all the leaders saw this vision for themselves. And what makes this story in particular, or this part of the story, important is that in the general telling of the story, that part is left out. What is left is this little girl did this. There are even songs about how Ngxande led people to their deaths, whereas it was, she told them that this is the vision that I had, this is what I was told. And then she took them. And all these men, all these leaders, all these chiefs, they saw the vision for themselves. They saw it. There was a vision in the ocean where the ancestors came out of the waves with their cows and livestock and things like that. So this happened according to this particular account. And that's what convinced everybody. So now all the chiefs went back to account to the king to say, we saw it for ourselves, so this is what we have to do with this. For me, what I didn't like, what I hated about this was that had this vision come to fruition and things worked out, we would have never known about Ngxande. We were going to know about all these men who did this and did that and did that. But now that things went sideways, everybody literally wrote themselves out of this story. And they left this little girl to be responsible for the most horrible of things that a group of people could have gone through. So coming back to now, how do you deal with a world falling apart? It sort of reminded me, now we're dealing with in an age of social media. Right now, as we speak, there are people who are rewriting what is happening in front of our eyes. They're telling us what is happening is not what is happening. They're writing out their wrongs out of history. They're writing themselves onto the other side of history while we're watching, And it's like, it's not even just that the world is falling apart. We are being sort of made to believe that the world is not falling apart. Actually, everything is fine. You should just leave things as it were. And what's going to happen is that when our great-grandchildren look back at history, this moment now we're in is going to look nothing like what we're actually seeing. They're going to read something totally different. So for me, it took away the anxiety of we're living in a world falling apart and I'm worried and I'm scared. I'm like, actually, we have to be as militant in this world that is falling apart to stand up, not for truth, because truth is something else, but for honesty. Mm-hmm. That while all these shifts are happening, we all need to be accountable for the coming generations, so that when they look back at this moment that we're in, they are not fed misinformation as if we were not here. Because if you look at what's happening, in the West and whatever, down the line, history is going to say Africa didn't even exist. Mm. Black people didn't even exist. Nothing ever happened. It was only this particular kind of history that happened. So we're going through a cycle, and we need to be accountable for this cycle, and we need to be accountable to people who are going to come after us to say, this is what actually happened, and this is no matter how horrible it is. Yeah.
And this was so important in the book for me. I mean, as a Xhosa woman who was a Xhosa girl, and growing up and hearing these conversations, there's an obsession about, did the apparition happen? Did she see the spirit? Did she lie? Did she not? I think for me, on a bodily level, there is a belief that that there's no question that the spirit did appear, but the conversation around whether I always think like I've never heard people reconsider that actually the spirit might have been the spirit of white people, because we know that they used witchcraft in also to aid the colonial process, and that whiteness in itself is a dark white supremacy coloniality is a dark living spiritual thing, and so for me I'm like, maybe a conversation actually about the nature of the spirit that appeared, that it could have been a deceptive spirit that white people were using in order to facilitate famine, because famine is a function of coloniality throughout history, Gaza right now, Free Palestine. And so, I mean, thank you so much for bringing that and for that amazing intervention around, had the vision worked, it most likely would have been men who, were at the forefront of that. Zara, I want to come to you, and this is a long one again. In your book, Zoe Simudzi writes about the violence of the archive, the violence of. She says the violence of object collection is coupled with the absenting of the peoples to whom the objects belong. They're rendering to an anthropological footnote, a conceptual disappearance outside of intellectual capture by Western civilization. And I argue that that it's an intellectual capturing and a spiritual extraction that the Western Museum does, known as ukutwala. So these objects then become a way in which whiteness consolidates the imprisonment of these spiritual objects and artifacts, become a way to ukutwala and to consolidate white supremacy. And then you, in another chapter, write about Bettina Malcolm's. And you say, Bettina Malcolm's, in some ways, makes an argument for understanding the Boer Wars through a kind of dialogue with land. A simple example, researchers can't access graves from the various native concentration camps because it's on white-owned private property. And these farmers are worried about the proof of such black graves could lay the foundation of a legitimate land claim in the context of land reform. So for me, there's a connection between the colonial archive, the spiritual consolidation of whiteness and coloniality, and the holding hostage of our ancestors' bones, you know. And I wonder if you can share.
Yeah, thanks for so eloquently connecting very different parts of the book into one question. That was awesome. But just for context for people, so essentially this project, it's kind of like a process document, right? Of a research fellowship I did with the World Museum in Amsterdam, Leiden, and Rotterdam, which is essentially a collection of ethnographic museums, but they also have histories in missionary museums, trade museums, mineralogical, as well as kind of medical museums, right? So there's a lot of different kind of a lot of different registers of this kind of extraction that you're speaking to present in these archives that I was working with. And why I kind of embarked on this project and why I do this work that I do as an artist, but as an artistic researcher really, is I'm interested in how these museums and what's present in these museums can help us understand broader questions, right? So in this case, the broader question really is the question around land and around death and death in life, right? The systemic dying that is imposed upon us as Black and Indigenous people in this country whilst we're still living, right? So it's not to say that whilst I'm breathing right now, that I'm not incurring a kind of death in the interim before my corporal death, right? So that's kind of the question that we were thinking through. And I think you're absolutely right. Like that's essentially a huge part of the work, is trying to expose the kind of logics, the archival logic and the violence that it imposes, not just on the so-called material that is stolen, right, but also on the folks from which this material has been stolen, and what kind of justifications become possible in the aftermath of this theft. And also in this extended, again, to use the word purgatory, that the purgatory that a lot of this material and our ancestors, in the case of human remains, are kind of relegated to, right? And I think what, I mentioned this yesterday, but I think what is so catastrophic about this is that, now there's this kind of this questions around return, repatriation, restitution, etc. But it's never really engaged with in a way that understands local kind of epistemological frameworks. So it's always on the idea of, okay, if we're talking about human remains in this case, the average, like, it's calculated, again, it's kind of science is used to like absolve. So in the case of human remains and say Germany's theft of Nama and Ova Herero folks from Namibia in the genocide there, in the conversations around returning these ancestors, there's an argument that's made that, okay, the average kind of human memory lasts around 120 years, so we don't really have to deal with any kind of consequences beyond that time frame, right? Never mind, there's no understanding of like, well, actually the ways in which we understand time is so much more nuanced than that, kind of linear 100 and whatever years. And so the consequences for return are more than just returning this thing that was stolen, and also because the ways in which these materials are changed fundamentally by being stolen, right? There's an entropy there that I think Western epistemological frameworks really, fail to understand and really take responsibility for. This material is changed irreversibly by being in these store homes, these storehouses, these massive containers, in the kind of like, they don't even get to like experience time in these archives because there's temperature control, they don't see sunlight, it's freezing in these spaces, so there's really this obsession with preserving and usurping time, actually, in these archives. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but there's so much, I think, in the kind of connections that you make that is really being missed. Also because these conversations around repatriation and return are happening on a bureaucratic level, predominantly, and we know the nation state is not really invested in our well-being in any real sense, especially not in our spiritual well-being. So like, yeah, the Namibian government doesn't care about the nuances. They want to go put these same ancestors in a museum, right? Not go and return these ancestors to Shark Island, as an example. So yeah, it's kind of a complex thing, but yeah, I think insisting on a different epistemological framework is necessary in doing this kind of work. And engaging in this kind of archival research that, in a way that doesn't subscribe to the demarcating of the African continent, is also really important. Because you cannot just assume that, so obviously like these archives are categorized according to the Berlin Convention, right? So it's categorized according to country, and then North Africa has a completely different curator and department to so-called sub-Saharan Africa. And then if you want to deal with the Caribbean or you want to deal with Oceania, you're dealing with like 5 different people who all have different understandings of blackness and Africanity. So if you want to engage in a kind of global blackness and a global, and a nuanced understanding of black spirituality that encompasses all these connections, it's not in the museum. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
I'm gonna just open it up for questions. I see a couple of hands. Yeah, I see a couple of hands. You can ask.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I have 2 quick questions, hopefully. The first generally to the panelists, including you, Wanelisa. How do you make sense of, there's kind of like this big wave returning about like astrology. Everyone's like very aware of their star signs right now. And it's just interesting to me because like growing up, those things were kind of like, relegated to, that's for, woo-woo people. People are taking it more seriously. Also, at the same time, there's a return to like indigeneity, indigenous knowledge systems. And then alongside that, there's also these massive scientific advancements that are happening in the cosmological space. I don't know if you guys have ever been to the observatory. It's very cool. And their focus there is spectroscopy, which is literally the study of rainbows, like electromagnetic radiation in a rainbow nation. You know what I mean? So, yeah. So my question is just, how do you guys see these kinds of phenomena happening at the same time, and what do they mean for you in our expression now of African spirituality? I didn't even touch on the fact that, there's also Christianity at play, but I'll leave that to you guys to unpack. And then my second question is specifically for you, Jeffrey, is how do you make sense of bringing up these important issues, but we're not always aware, like, who's in the room when we're talking about it, right? There is, as Wanelisa was mentioning, being a black woman listening to this, you feel like, oh, I'm not supposed to be hearing this. But then I also am like very aware of people who aren't part of our coming from the same like identity being like, I don't want Sally next to me to run off and be like, oh guys, what are they doing to the black boys in the mountain, because that's not the conversation that we want to be having. And in that light, what interventions do you see being made in that context? Because if we're asking a post-colonial, post-apartheid system to intervene, we know how that system is violent, and I don't see that being capable of dealing with these issues in a way that gives effect to what you are trying to say, which is that, it's not that the practice must be done away with, but there are practices within it that are problematic. So I'm just curious about how you see those interventions being made. Thanks.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to answer that question first.
No, but we'll take a couple of questions.
Okay. My question is, science has been used as a weapon against, as a weapon of colonialism since it got really big, putting people on display, judging people by bones and structures. Is there a way to reconcile this philosophical understanding of science and culture and cosmology of Africa?
I can take a hand there, and there's a hand in front. Oh. I'm going to take 2 more hands, and then I'm going to move on.
Thank you. There's so much to say about everything you guys are saying, but I would like once again to speak to you, Jeffrey. In my personal growing awareness over the last few years, I've come to understand that part of the colonial project was to impose this idea of gender on indigenous people. And as a student of isiXhosa language, I see how little genderization is actually in the language and how the Western mind has actually imposed that. That's the impression I'm getting. I want to ask you, Jeffrey, if you could speak into where those practices seem to be coming from. Are they ancient isiXhosa, or where are those malpractices actually based? I would be interested in hearing your opinion.
Can I have one hand at top, and then we'll have to move on.
Yeah, it is working now. Sorry, we're struggling with the microphone. Thank you for the panel, very incredible. I come to this having religiously followed Vusumzi's podcast and had this unraveling of what African spirituality was, its connection to the rest of the world on a spiritual level, to the environment, to, it's, I'm very grateful for that. And part of what I got from the podcast, which actually let my guard down as a very Christianized modern woman, and let me actually engage and learn, was the fact that our ancestors are complex beings. They do not just become great saints, positive, all good. There is good and bad spirits, and there is good and bad motivations. And I got to really engage with my spirituality as an African from that perspective. And it makes sense then that from the rituals that have been preserved and are still being practiced, there are bad actors, there are bad things that are being passed down, there are harmful things. And whilst a lot of us have turned away from our the consciousness of our spirituality, we have not developed, if I could say, and some of those practices have been stuck in periods of anger, of not dealing with change, with social, global change. And some of those are being really taken from some spiritual leaders or ancestors that were bad actors themselves. That brings me to asking Jeffrey, and hopefully you too, Vusi, South Africa has a big problem with femicide, and if you look at it from a modern lens, you can see that there's been rapid empowerment of women. There's a very modern society, but you also have a very traditional society, of people that still practice certain practices that a lot of us have lost because of colonization. So you have these young men that are being taught, in a very patriarchal, traditional sense, and then being launched into a world where women are so empowered, so modern, where life is so indifferent to the place that the rituals and initiations is giving them.
I'm sorry, my sister. Can you land the question for us, please?
So I want to really ask, how do we reconcile? How do we heal that? How do we preserve those practices or fix where there is malpractice, and give those young men to the young women that are empowered today?
Thank you.
Sorry,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very
quick, my brother.
I'll be quick. I'm struggling with the format of these conversations, because one, they're very generative and useful and speaking truth that we need to hear. But I'm struggling with the fact that it seems like we're telling again the black pain, black story, the struggle of black people, spiritually in relation to gender and all of that, to an audience that is continuing to consume this. There's an element of the way these spaces are curated that becomes a bit vampiristic. So, do you have any ideas in terms of how we can break that? Because we're sitting here as the audience, kind of like taking an objective positionality. Like, how are we, while we are deeply implicated in these histories that are still continuing even now? So maybe the question is, what would you want to say to the audience directly?
I don't know. Maybe Jeffrey, let me start with you, and then we can go. Oops. Okay. Zara?
Okay. The first question around this kind of prevalence around astrology and spirituality, etc. I mean, I'm not really going to speak to astrology. It's not my chat, right? But I think what is really interesting is the prevalence of folks being called at the moment. And I think it's not a coincidence that this is happening now after the kind of imposition of, what we spoke about earlier with the Witchcraft Suppression Act, etc., where, like, my mother is an example, my great-grandmother wasn't able to answer the calling or even understand the calling in a very particular way. And I think that's really interesting, the amount of folks, at least within my immediate environment, who are being called into some kind of spiritual practice, whether it's a kind of South African lineage or Eastern lineage or even Celtic lineage of healing. I think that's really telling to the kind of times that we're in, where we're really trying to reckon our existence as people in relation to this kind of like late capitalist catastrophe. And I think it's important to understand these things as like knowledge systems that can be corrupted, but also there are kernels, I think, of opportunity and possibility in understanding that catastrophe. It's not just a social and political question or problem, but it is also an aesthetic one too. So that's the first thing that I'm going to say on the first question. The second question around reconciling what you're terming is like science, but what I'm hearing is eugenics, so it's not really just science, but it's like racism. I don't know that we need to necessarily reconcile racist practices with African cosmology. I don't know, and this is not to say that science is automatically racist, right? But I think, again, it's understanding that all these knowledge systems can be corrupted, including the one, that Jeffrey has been speaking about. The corruption is, we are fallible beings, right? Like human beings are deeply fallible. And so I don't know, I almost don't know how to answer the question in a sense, because what is it that we're trying to reconcile? I think what's important is that we're trying to work towards a situation where we're insisting on life in death regardless. And that's really, I think, the goal of this project. Yeah, I'll maybe stop there, and if there's anything else. The last question. What would I want to leave the audience or whatever? So, I mean, it's funny, we're speaking about African cosmologies and stuff today, but my main practice is actually, I'm a sound practitioner. I'm an artist who's cosplaying as a writer for the weekend, what I'm really interested in is trying to get people to embody themselves through working with sound. I'm really interested in how do we allow ourselves to have a haptic understanding of the world as opposed to one that's relegated or only located up here. And I think in that way it's a bit more generative and life-affirming and life-insisting. Thank you.
The battle of the masculinities.
Oh my God, okay. Thanks, Vusi. The first question that I will answer was about interventions, and in my case, I don't think there's been enough intervention, or the intimidation from the people who try to contribute to this conversation has worked. We have seen what has happened with Ngxande, the wound, and that worked. And few people have written about this ritual in terms of criticizing it, and they've been intimidated, and it worked. So we are today the government's intervention is that all you have to do is to register the ritual. What happens there, we no longer care. And there are illegal schools. When boys die in illegal schools, they died in illegal schools, so we don't get anywhere there. But when they die in government-registered schools, even that one, no one says anything about it. So the media is kind of misleading in terms of categorizing this thing in terms of legal. All initiation schools for me are illegal schools because boys dies anyway. And my question to the rest of South Africa, as I said, is that are we prepared to die as Africans than to live as human beings? So the second question is coming from or based from. So I'm Pedi, so our initiation is not far different from the Xhosa initiation. So ours is called Koma. So in my studies and everything, I tried so much to kind of find a comparison between the Pedi initiation and the Xhosa initiation, but I fell short in my studies, so I kind of looked outside the country, and yes, there was kind of anthropological works that were helpful and everything. So as to what they come from, I think they come from a point where we have to make sure that women stay in their place. And it's kind of working because women today, we are kind of losing the narrative is that there's kind of justification as to why men are killing women. And women, they were like, yeah, that makes sense somehow. And it's sad. So as to where they come from, I think they come from old drunk men who were bored. And we need to tell it the way it is and make intervention. I'm not saying we should abolish the ritual, but it is angering and it should be about anger. I'm saying that keep what works and remove the rest that doesn't work, and put the women inside, because being a man in a room full of men only teaches you how to perform masculinity than to be a human being. So how do we preserve or fix the ritual? I think I answered that one in terms of keep what works. I wouldn't have a problem abolishing it, but I understand it from an African perspective in terms of to a culture. It's our culture, it's our identity. We're so proud of it. We're seeing even government leaders. Fikile Mbalula was initiated through kidnapping, and he came back and he was proud of it. So those are the kind of people that are supposed to make change. And the people who kidnapped him, they were so shocked and said, how can we be led by a man who is not a man? He hasn't gone through the initiation and everything. So it was kind of said that it works in kidnapping government officials. What about young men? So I think it is a...
That's very profound. If you can kidnap a minister, what about...
Yeah, so I think we cannot expect righteousness to prevail when no one is prepared to put themselves up for a righteous cause. We are in a very difficult point. It's not even funny anymore. It is a sad low point of madness cast adrift. And this is just my contribution, not saying this is the answer. I'm just saying, please, guys, please, we cannot wake up every morning with this kind of stories and we scroll to social media and everything. I think likes, retweets, and comments won't help us anymore. We need people on the ground, we need voices, we need everyone to come to the table. So I hope I've answered the questions right. Thank you.
Can I just add something on that reconciling issues of culture, just to, and I'll be quick. We sometimes function from this premise that culture is void of politics. And that culture is culture and culture is sacred, and it's an enclosed unit that is void of any kind of political intervention. Here's my understanding of how the two exist, right? There are certain cycles of nature and spirit that happen regardless. A woman can get pregnant and a child is born. Everything that happens around that is political. Right? How you attend to that. This is a natural process of a human being coming into the world. It stands. How we treat that, a lot of it is actually political and is situational in a time and space kind of a thing. there is a point in the life of a human being where there is a need to transition. In science, they will talk about hormones and teenagehood and adolescence and all of those things. There is a need within a human being to transition and to be held and be carried through a process of transitioning. What that is, the mechanics of it are all political, right? You can look at there will be initiation for young boys and things like that. Ushaka turned those into army regiments and turned them into an army, which is what happens across many other cultures. That same process, you can have boys who would be transitioned into certain kinds of men who look after the family, or they can be transitioned into armies who go and attack other people or defend. And even as we grow older, things like marriage, there is a need for a coming together of a man and a woman to bring forth life into the world. Everything else around that is political, based on the culture, based on the time, and based on what people in that particular context feel is spiritually and culturally relevant. So in terms of interventions, is understanding that these things actually are malleable. They are not set in stone. We actually can change. But what we can't change is the importance of all of these moments and all of these transitions and all of these cycles of nature and our connection to cosmology and our connection to the spirit world. Those things we cannot change. And in the process of us trying to change it, that is how we cause harm, not just to ourselves, but to generations to come.
Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. When I was drafting the questions, I have like 30 questions, and they're all essay questions. And so I think it also just speaks to, I'm just manifesting, a much longer conversation in the future around this. And to answer the question that was, I personally am a strong believer in the praxis of ukuthoboza kuvaliwe, and so for me, I am constantly trying to figure out how, in a space where there will be black souls, and black souls who are walking with their ancestors, to figure out how do I start the conversation around the spiritual nature of coloniality and the spiritual capturing of Abantu. And unfortunately, white people are going to be there, but I always pray that izihlwele zethu zisifihle. Njengoba sithethe izihlwele zethu zisifihle kwabelungu nobugqirha babelungu. And to the question around Sally, listening to the conversation about, I think one of the important things around asking and thinking through an African cosmology, because if I'm having a conversation with you about the spiritual vows that happen because of song and the transcendent nature and the movement that song facilitates for us as African people into other worlds, into the ancestral world and the spirit world, and then we link that to Ulwaluko and the songs. I particularly think that Sally is going to get stuck within Park intersectionality, now Park with gender theory. But when we talk about the spiritual capturing of African masculinities and African men, and that's a different conversation that I think Sally might try and maybe rope in Asanda as a researcher. But that, again, as a research assistant, not as a researcher, let me clarify. But then again, I also continue to pray that izihlwele zethu zisifihle, because I can't just know yenza. Thank you so much. Thank you.